An edited version of the following essay appeared in the magazine Parabola, Myth, Tradition, The Search for Meaning, in the summer of 2003. Where God is hiding in each boy. Sometimes, at the end of a difficult day, I've heard a corrections worker say, "I feel like I'm doing life 8 hours at a time." Prison work takes its toll. I teach anger management and moral thinking skills at the Juvenile Correctional Facility in Red Wing, Minnesota, the institution a young Bob Dylan sang of but never visited. Work with juveniles is stressful. Work in a treatment-oriented prison environment is often more so. An entire nation's projections stew in this culturally constructed cauldron. This year, I'm working with juvenile sex offenders, young pedophiles, prostitutes, flashers, and rapists. Some are mentally ill. Some were homeless. Their childhoods were as ugly and disturbing as the acts that brought them to us. If a worker is to remain healthy in this unique environment, he must look for a spiritual connection to a deeper divine entity. Every day is a day of spiritual work in this crucible. The day-to-day activities of teaching are intensified by the physical structure and the psychological containment of the young men. I arrived here on a dare. The mythologist and storyteller Michael Meade challenged a group of storytellers to take their stories to juvenile institutions. I happened upon the job at Red Wing. Many of the teachers, officers, administrators, and caseworkers have served youth for decades. One colleague, a frontline caseworker, Dane Peterson, has worked at Red Wing for over 30 years. He has had to teach basic hygiene skills, to find appropriate foster homes, to arrange jobs, to contact courts and schools, complete reams of mandatory paperwork, and guide shamed young men toward a deeper sense of self-worth. He has dealt with sexual propositions, violent physical threats and assaults, emotional breakdowns, and radical political policy swings. Throughout, he has maintained a liveliness and cheerful dedication to his work. As an ordained Lutheran minister, he chose to serve this community, not as a chaplain, but as a caseworker. He sees his work as a spiritual discipline. Just as importantly, he maintains a vital physical, spiritual, and mental life outside of the institution. Other workers have also been ordained or are deeply involved in their spiritual disciplines. A chief administrator serves as a deacon at his church. A number of teachers lead religious study classes. Among the volunteer grandmothers who spend many hours each week with the boys, one is a nun from a convent down the road. Another has volunteered continuously for over 40 years. Chemical dependency counselors from 12-step programs and visiting or assigned chaplains arrive regularly. Each week, a Native American elder leads a sweat lodge ceremony. Correction workers and volunteers in this institution and other institutions serve the spiritual world, the clientele, that is the public, and the residents. And he serves himself or herself. Corrections workers must face the demons of the environment with spiritual and psychological strength, or the atmosphere may quickly deteriorate. It may become dangerous and do more harm to residents or the staff. The writer Marie-Louise von Franz described a demon as the one-sidedness of a complex which eats up a person. When the person is eaten up, as some of our residents are when they arrive, the demon entangles itself in the surrounding environment. If a staff member is being eaten by the environment, he spirals into desperate cynicism. Dane Peterson says, "I have survived because I look to see where God is hiding in each boy, and God is always hiding there. And that awareness keeps me going." The African medicine healer and scholar, Malidoma Somé, who has worked with Meade and juvenile gang members in California, said that when he first meets someone, "I look beyond the physical man and address his soul standing right behind his body." When working in a prison, it is necessary that you bring this skill with you or learn it. The Qigong teacher and psychologist Patrick Doherty says, "To pray for someone most effectively, simply hold the image of a person's true essence in your mind." The most effective corrections workers seem able to imagine the true essences of the young men in their care. Among the stories I use with my anger management students is The Dark Man's Sooty Brother, a Grimm's tale often told by poet Robert Bly. In this tale, a young man has been discharged from the army. He is penniless, homeless, without family and far from home. He is offered and takes a job to keep the dark man's cauldrons boiling underground for 7 years. He is supplied with enough to eat, a place to sleep, and just enough work to keep busy. He neither cuts his hair, nor trims his nails, nor wipes the tears from his sooty face. As one of the conditions of his employment, he agrees not to look inside the cauldrons to see what is boiling there. After a while, he steals a look into the cauldrons and sees his own grief and his own history. Of course, that was what the dark man wanted in the first place. The young man sees his military superiors in the cauldrons and says, "You made my life miserable. Now I will make you miserable." The young man stokes the fires to make the cauldrons boil more violently. A gang member, a soldier in my class, immediately identified with the story's hero. The misery must boil up. The steam must work on the man. When the hero re-enters the world above, his wage is a sack of wood chips, which transform into gold coins. I ask my students to imagine that the diploma or GED they earn, the social skills they learn, and the tolerance and acceptance they find are those wood chips. Often it takes faith on their part. In the tale, the young man returns above ground in his sooty clothes, with his shaggy appearance, and he is immediately robbed of his gold. He returns to the underground to be cleaned and washed by the dark man. He's given another sack of wood chips and learns the value of his cleaned self. In this shining state, he attracts and eventually marries the king's daughter. Our residents need to access and acknowledge their grief to get a clearer sense of their own essences. Sometimes treatment work helps. Psychological therapy may help. Spiritual practice sometimes helps. In corrections, there is always an opportunity for self-scrutiny, restorative healing, and spiritual work for the resident and for the corrections worker. There usually comes a moment when a young man may choose a different path. Yet, only if we workers do our own spiritual grief work, utilize our own self-scrutiny, and continue our own spiritual practices, will we recognize that moment for what it is and help him to take the next step. The environment of a juvenile prison is a cauldron for us also. Bob Roberts, the founder of a successful prison transition program in New Orleans, Project Return, said, "Only when an individual emotionally breaks through his wall of denial and accesses his grief in a communal setting will he begin to move out of the devastating circle of recidivist behaviors." As in the Grimm's tale, a young man, or for that matter an older man, must grieve his losses in a sacred space and exhume the buried stones of anger that he has carried for so long. Then he can continue unto his next stage of life. Dane Peterson told me, "I am merely a way station for these boys. I can't take credit for their successes, nor do I take the blame for their failures. I can only offer my service while they're here. On many days, it takes faith and more spiritual work."